comes to your mind when you think of peace? Whenever I ask this question, silence like this one often fills the room. So I flip it. What comes to your mind when you think of war and conflict? And suddenly, it's easier to imagine. We see the headlines spreading across the news. We see the smoke rising from places torn apart. And we see the faces of families forced to flee, and those empty eyes of those who have lost everything. But when we do think of peace, we tend to picture something grand and political, leaders gathered around long tables, negotiating terms and finally signing the peace agreements, as cameras try to capture the moment. And we've seen it just last week with the signing of the peace deal between Cambodia and Thailand. And while the date and context may differ, I see also a striking similarity between these two pictures. In 1991, the Paris Peace Agreements were signed, marking an important step in ending the long civil war that followed after the Khmer Rouge genocide. The agreement opened the door to one of the largest and most complex UN peacekeeping missions of its time. More than 21,000 UN personnel from 46 countries, contributing with a budget of over $1.6 billion over a period of 18 months. In many ways, this agreement was historic. But what happens after the signature, after the mission ends, and after the international attention fades? How is peace built, and who sustains it in the years and decades that follow? And this is where my research comes in. It was carried out alongside the production of the documentary film We Forgive, But We Don't Forget, which I co-directed with Cambodian filmmaker Rethinking. The film follows Buddhist monks, genocide survivors, artists, educators, and community leaders in post-conflict Cambodia. Individuals we might not even immediately see as peace builders, yet who carry peace forward in quiet, everyday, and local ways that rarely make those headlines we just seen, but deeply shape life after conflict. Even 50 years after the Khmer Rouge came to power and more than 3 decades after the signing of the agreement, their work is ongoing. And we kind of start to see that peace is not just the moment. But let me take you back to where all of this began, actually. So after my exchange semester in Singapore, I decided to backpack around the region and visit Cambodia. And one day, my tuk-tuk driver took me first to a pepper farm, and on our way back home, he stopped by a lake known locally as the Secret Lake. It looked peaceful, very calm. Fishermen were casting their lines, one was standing waist deep in the water. But then, my driver, a middle-aged man, told me its story. He said, no bodies have ever been recovered, but sometimes when fishermen pull in their catch, they find human bones. So what looked like this natural lake was in fact a man-made reservoir built through the forced labor of the Khmer Rouge era. So I asked him, what does peace mean to you? He laughed and then stopped for a moment and said, people think peace is just about no more war. But for us Cambodian people, we have a saying, we forgive, but we don't forget. It is hard, you know, we have lost so many. But peace is about remembering and rebuilding day by day. His words stayed with me, and they later became the title of my work. And through it, I wanted to make the invisible visible by showing that Cambodia's story is not only one of war and conflict, but goes beyond the killing fields. A story of the people who have been building peace ever since on the ground. So I brought research and filmmaking together to explore peace building through a local lens, a visual method, and a reflexive approach. Now, what does all of this mean? Working locally meant moving away from top-down liberal models of peace building and instead focusing on the agency of local actors, communities, and everyday practices that sustain peace. So let me give you an example from the documentary. This is Bonnie and Hu. They are the founders of Lock Hong Commit, which translates into Thinking Theatre, a small theatre group that works with marginalized and vulnerable communities. And together, they bring real stories like those of women affected by domestic violence onto the stage, using a form of theatre called forum theatre. So the actors, those who lived through the stories themselves, perform the play 2 times. But it is the second time that the audience can interrupt by shouting, "Stop," when something feels unjust. Come onto the stage and try to change the course of the story. And because these are quite sensitive topics, they work with village chiefs. And in Cambodian society, the village chief is often regarded as the first person to turn for advice or approval to hold such community events. And this is exactly the kind of peace building that doesn't fit into the traditional research, or that traditional research struggles to capture. It is relational, emotional, and grounded in the everyday life. Things that don't fit neatly into statistics or policy reports or numbers that we've seen. And like theater, filmmaking can make these invisible dimensions visible. The tension on an actor's face as she reenacts her own story, or the tears in an audience member's eyes as he realizes that he's been the violent man in real life. And this process also required reflexivity. And being reflexive meant recognizing that the process of making this film depends on my own perspectives and biases and by choices that hold power, right? Where I put the camera, how I ask the questions, what we include and leave out in the final film. And there is this ethical responsibility of telling stories with the people and not about them. And this is why I worked with Cambodian filmmaker Rethinking and the local film crew. Now, this kind of knowledge that came from making this film became part of the peace-building process itself. What matters is what the project continues to do, how it's received, how it circulates, and how people engage with it. And this matters even more now, when civil societies face growing restrictions, artistics and media freedoms are shrinking, and organizations are under increasing pressure. Peace itself is fragile. And all of this brings me back to the question I asked you in the beginning. What comes to your mind when you think of peace? Changing how we answer that question matters, because we cannot create what we cannot visualize, and we cannot build what we cannot imagine. Thank you.